My name is Freya. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside rooms where decisions were made quietly, conference rooms with glass walls, late-night emails that felt heavier than they looked, and expectations that were never written down but always understood. I'm not loud. I don't dominate conversations. I've never been the person people point to and say, she's the powerful one. And for a long time, that suited everyone just fine. People usually describe me as dependable, calm, easy to work with, the kind of person who handles things. There's a compliment hidden in that, but also a convenience. When you're calm, people assume you'll absorb discomfort without complaint. When you're capable, they assume your boundaries are flexible. When you don't make scenes, they assume you won't make one now. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about public humiliation or dramatic takedowns. It's about a slow realization, about how certain environments reward silence until the moment that silence becomes inconvenient. It's about being pushed, subtly at first, into roles you never agreed to play. And it's about the quiet moment when you realize that compliance has been mistaken for consent. What you'll hear is a first-person account of a professional boundary being crossed again and again, always framed as just part of the job. Late nights, unspoken expectations, a culture where saying no was treated as a lack of team spirit, and being available after hours, especially as a woman, was considered a soft skill rather than a cost. I want to be clear, this is not a story where I suddenly become fearless overnight. There's no explosion, no shouting match in a boardroom, no cinematic victory. The emotional journey here is slower and more uncomfortable. It moves from confusion to self-doubt to clarity, from trying to be reasonable to realizing that reason alone doesn't protect you, and finally to a moment where I spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough that it couldn't be ignored. There's a CEO in this story, yes. There are clients and late-night demands framed as networking and entertaining. But the heart of the story isn't about villains. It's about systems that blur lines on purpose, and about what happens when someone decides to redraw those lines without asking permission. I'm telling this now because I know how easy it is to question yourself in situations like these, to wonder if you're overreacting, to tell yourself it's temporary or that you're lucky to be trusted. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you exactly what happened to me, honestly and without embellishment, and what it cost me to stay quiet for as long as I did. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that something you tolerated was slowly teaching others how to treat you? At work, I was the person people forgot to introduce in meetings, until they needed an answer no one else had. I sat slightly to the side of the conference tables, laptop open, listening more than speaking. When someone asked a question about a client's history, a clause in a contract, or why a deal had stalled 6 months earlier, heads would turn toward me without anyone saying my name. I would answer. They would nod. Then the conversation would move on as if the information had appeared on its own. I wasn't offended by that at first. I told myself it was efficiency. I told myself visibility wasn't the same thing as value. And for a long time, that was true enough to keep me comfortable. My title sounded important on paper, Senior Client Operations Manager. But titles are elastic things. They stretch to fit whatever a company needs at the moment. Officially, my role was to manage relationships, smooth processes, and anticipate problems before they surfaced. Unofficially, I was the buffer, the one who made difficult clients feel heard, the one who stayed late so executives didn't have to, the one who absorbed tension so it never reached the top floor. People describe me as unflappable. That word came up a lot. Calm under pressure, reliable, low maintenance. I didn't argue with those descriptions because they were mostly true. I liked being good at my job. I liked knowing things others didn't bother to learn. I liked being trusted. What I didn't notice, at least not right away, was how quickly trust slid into expectation. When I joined the company, I was grateful. The role was a step up. The salary was fair. The leadership talked about culture in thoughtful, polished ways. Flexibility, mutual respect, a flat hierarchy, all the right words. And in the beginning, those words seemed to match the reality. I stayed late sometimes, but so did everyone else. I answered emails at night, but they were occasional. When clients needed reassurance, I was good at giving it. When things got tense, I was sent in, not because I was expendable, but because I was effective. That's what I believed. In meetings, I wasn't talked over. I was listened to, but I was rarely credited. My ideas were often repeated later by someone else, phrased slightly differently, and then praised. I noticed that pattern early. I remember clocking it, the way you clock a habit in someone you care about but don't intend to confront. You tell yourself it's not malicious. You tell yourself it's just how groups work. And because I didn't push back, the story others told about me solidified quietly. Freya is fine with it. Freya doesn't mind. Freya can handle that. I didn't correct them, not because I lacked the words, but because nothing felt egregious enough to justify the discomfort of speaking up. Each individual moment was small, easy to rationalize, easy to dismiss. I was also aware, always, that I was one of the few women in rooms where after-hours bonding mattered. Deals were strengthened over late dinners, drinks, and informal gatherings that blurred the line between professional and personal. I attended when it made sense. I left early when I could. No one objected. No one insisted. At least not then. From the outside, I think it looked like I had it figured out. A steady career, respect without drama, a reputation for being solid. But there's a difference between being respected and being relied on without regard. I hadn't learned to tell the difference yet. Looking back now, I can see how neatly I fit into the role they needed filled. Not a threat, not a problem. Not someone whose absence would be noticed immediately, but someone whose presence made everything run more smoothly. Invisibility isn't always about being ignored. Sometimes it's about being seen only for what you provide, not for what it costs you to provide it. At the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt useful. I felt trusted. And I mistook those feelings for safety. I didn't know yet that this version of me, the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who never made things awkward, was already being used as evidence that my boundaries were negotiable. The first time it happened, it was framed as a favor. It was a Thursday evening, already past 7. Most of the office lights were off, and the cleaning crew had started moving quietly between desks. I was packing up, mentally shifting into the relief that comes with the end of a long day, when my phone buzzed with a message from my director. "Quick question, are you free tonight?" I remember pausing, fingers still on my laptop zipper. I was technically free. I had no urgent plans, just dinner waiting at home, and the comfort of routine. I typed back that I was heading out, but couldn't talk. He called instead of replying. There was a client in town unexpectedly. Important one. Long relationship. Sensitive account. The CEO was already meeting them for drinks, but things felt informal. It might help, he said, to have someone there who knew the history, someone the client trusted, someone who could smooth the edges. He said my name the way people do when they're asking for something they've already decided you'll give. I asked what time. He said soon. He said it wouldn't be long. He said it would be appreciated. Nothing about the request was explicit enough to refuse without feeling dramatic. No one said entertain. No one said to stay late for our comfort. It was all couched in language about support and teamwork. So I went. The bar was upscale, dimly lit, already loud with after-work energy. The CEO greeted me warmly, almost relieved. The client smiled wider when he saw me and made a comment about how nice it was to see a familiar face. I took a seat, ordered a drink I didn't really want. For the first hour, it was normal. Work talk, light jokes, industry gossip. I answered a few questions, clarified a timeline. Everything I said was professional, useful, and appropriate. Then the tone shifted, not sharply, but enough to notice. The conversation drifted into personal territory. Stories about travel, about work wives, about how certain people were better at making clients feel taken care of. The CEO laughed along, didn't redirect, didn't shut it down. At one point, the client leaned toward me and said, "They always send you when they want us to feel comfortable." It wasn't meant unkindly. It wasn't even inaccurate. But something in my chest tightened when he said it. Not fear, not anger, just awareness. By the time I left, it was close to 11. I walked to my car in the cold, heels in one hand, jacket pulled tight around me. No one had touched me. No one had crossed a line that HR would recognize. And yet something felt off. The next morning, my director thanked me, said the client had been happy, said it made a difference. The CEO nodded at me in the hallway, casual, approving. No one asked if I'd been comfortable. No one acknowledged the hour. No one suggested time off in return. And I didn't bring it up. That was the cut. Not the night itself, but how easily it was absorbed into normalcy. How quickly it was filed under things Freya can handle. How little space there was to question it without sounding ungrateful. I told myself it was a one-off. That meant I was trusted. That being useful sometimes meant being flexible. but a small cut doesn't hurt much when it happens. You notice it later when you realize it never fully closed. After that night, nothing changed. And that, I think, is how it worked. There was no formal shift in my role, no announcement, no meeting where expectations were reset. Instead, there were small, almost invisible adjustments, like the way a room feels warmer after someone quietly turns up the heat. A few weeks later, another message came in after hours. Different client, same tone. Are you around tonight? This time, it was framed as dinner. Still professional, still harmless on the surface. Still optional enough that saying no would require explanation. I hesitated longer before replying. I told myself it was reasonable to ask. I reminded myself that my job involved relationships. I told myself I was overthinking the discomfort because nothing objectively bad had happened before. So I said yes again. And again, the night passed without incident. No lines crossed, no scenes, just long hours, drinks I didn't need, laughter that didn't include me but relied on me being there. I noticed how easily my presence softened the room, how the men relaxed when I arrived, as if a certain tone had been achieved simply by me taking a seat. That's when I started to understand something I hadn't wanted to name. My role wasn't just operational, it was atmospheric. I was there to make things feel balanced, polite, human, to absorb awkwardness so others didn't have to. And because I did it well, because I didn't complain or demand credit, it became part of what was expected from me. During the day, I was praised for my professionalism. At night, I was praised for my availability. The two blurred together until I couldn't tell where my actual job ended. I began to notice patterns. Who got asked to stay late and who didn't? Who was expected to show up socially and who was protected from it? The men with families were never pressured. The younger male associates were rarely invited. It was always framed as seniority, as trust, but it landed on the same shoulders every time. Mine. When I tried to set small boundaries, they were ignored. I'd suggest leaving earlier. I'd mention an early morning meeting. The response was always friendly, always casual. Of course, if you need to go. But the look that followed said something else. It would be inconvenient if you did. So I stayed. And the more I stayed, the more normal it became. 11 turned into midnight. One drink turned into two. The CEO started including me in messages directly, bypassing my director. He'd say things like, "You're good with people," or "You know how to handle these guys." Compliments that felt increasingly like instructions. I rationalized it all. I told myself I was lucky to be included. That visibility came in many forms. That this was how influence worked in real life, not just on org charts. I reminded myself that no one was forcing me, that I could say no anytime. But the truth is, once a behavior becomes normalized, refusing it feels like breaking a rule you never agreed to, but are somehow expected to obey. I stopped talking about it with friends because I didn't want to sound dramatic. I stopped noticing my own exhaustion because it felt unprofessional. I started planning my evenings with the assumption that they weren't fully mine. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it's quiet, polite, and perfectly reasonable until you realize you've adjusted your entire sense of self around it. By then, staying silent wasn't about being agreeable. It was about preserving the version of me everyone else had grown comfortable with. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, small moments that, on their own, seemed insignificant, but together formed a shape I could no longer ignore. I was in a meeting with the executive team when one of the newer managers asked who would be handling a visiting client the following week. Before anyone answered, the CEO glanced in my direction and said, almost absent-mindedly, "Freya will take care of it. Do not handle the account, not managing the logistics. Just take care of it." The room nodded. No one questioned it, including me. That was the moment I understood the role I'd been given. Not formally, not on paper, but socially, culturally. I was the closer without the commission. The host without the authority. The person who made uncomfortable interactions smoother by absorbing the discomfort myself. Reliable, useful, invisible. And because I performed that role well, it stopped being seen as a favor I was doing and started being treated as a trait I possessed. As if this was simply who I was. When schedules were discussed, mine was assumed to be flexible. When clients were difficult, I was sent in. When someone needed to stay late, it was rarely debated whose evening would be sacrificed. The assumption was always the same. I noticed how the language around me changed. I was no longer asked. I was informed. Still politely, still kindly, but with a certainty that made refusal feel disruptive. You don't mind, right? You're great at this. They really respond to you. Each sentence sounded like praise. Each one carried an expectation. I also noticed how little space there was for me to be anything else. I couldn't be tired. I couldn't be unavailable. I couldn't be uncomfortable without risking the image that protected me. And that image, calm, capable, accommodating, had once been a strength. Now it was a balk. The hardest part was realizing how complicit I'd been in building it. Every time I said yes without pause, every time I smiled instead of questioning, every time I told myself it wasn't worth the tension to push back, I'd been rewarded for disappearing into the role. And now, stepping out of it felt dangerous. I started to see how gender played into it, though no one ever said it out loud. I was expected to soften rooms, not dominate them, to listen, not lead, to be present, but not central. When I spoke with authority during the day, it was respected. When I was present at night, it was expected. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it harder to name. No one was trying to hurt me. They were simply benefiting from a system that worked in their favor, and from my willingness to adapt to it. The role I was assigned didn't come with power. It came with access. And access, I was learning, is often mistaken for influence until you try to use it. By then, something in me had started to shift. Quietly. Not toward anger, but toward clarity. I was beginning to understand that being indispensable is not the same as being protected. And once you see the role you're playing, you have to decide whether you're willing to keep performing it. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said what I'd been rehearsing in my head. It happened on an ordinary evening in a quiet space when no one else was watching. It was another late request, not urgent, not dramatic, just a message that landed after hours with the familiar ease of entitlement. Client wants to grab a drink tonight. Can you join? I stared at my phone longer than usual. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because for the first time, I noticed how automatic the expectation felt. As if my presence was a given, as if my evening had already been accounted for. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I stayed where I was, sitting on my couch, shoes off, dinner half eaten. I let the silence stretch. And in that silence, something settled. I realized I wasn't tired in the way people usually mean. I wasn't burned out from overwork. I was tired of being pre-decided, of having my availability assumed, of being included only in ways that benefited others. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for months. What would happen if I stopped? Not dramatically, not forever, just what if I didn't automatically say yes? The answer that came back wasn't fear, it was curiosity. I thought about how carefully I managed risk at work, how I documented conversations, how I noticed inconsistencies others missed, how much institutional knowledge I carried quietly without advertising it. I thought about how often I'd protected the company by smoothing things over before they escalated. And I wondered why none of that seemed to protect me. I replied an hour later. I said I couldn't make it. I gave no elaborate explanation, just a neutral, professional decline. The response was polite, short, no worries. But something in the tone felt different, cooler, less familiar. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but internally, a line had been drawn. Not between me and them, but between what I would continue to tolerate and what I wouldn't. I didn't suddenly become brave. I became honest. Honest with myself about the cost of staying quiet. Honest about how much I'd been giving without being asked if I could afford it. From that moment on, my silence changed texture. It wasn't compliance anymore. It was a choice. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being something others can take from you. After that night, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't set new rules or request a meeting to clarify boundaries. I simply began to pause. When messages came in late, I didn't respond immediately. When invitations were framed as assumptions, I asked neutral questions. How long is this expected to run? What's the objective? Is this required? I stayed calm, curious, professional. From the outside, nothing looked different. I was still polite, still reliable, still doing my job well, but internally, the dynamic had shifted. My silence wasn't empty anymore. It was deliberate. People often mistake quiet for passivity. They assume that if you're not protesting, you're agreeing. What they don't consider is that silence can be a form of observation. I started noticing things more clearly once I stopped rushing to fill gaps. who documented decisions and who didn't, who relied on verbal assurances instead of written ones, which client promises lived only in late-night conversations. I began to keep records, not obsessively, not defensively, just accurately, dates, requests, context, patterns. When after-hours expectations were implied, I let them be implied. I didn't volunteer. I didn't compensate. I didn't smooth over the discomfort when someone realized I wasn't automatically available. And slowly, subtly, people became uneasy. They still smiled, still complimented my work. But there was a new edge to it, a sense that something was missing, though they couldn't quite name what. The CEO started asking more questions in meetings. My director followed up more carefully. Clients noticed when I wasn't present and asked where I was. Those moments were brushed off easily enough, but each one left a small gap where my silence used to be filled with effort. What surprised me most was how quickly my absence created friction. No one accused me of doing anything wrong. They couldn't. I was still fulfilling my role, still meeting expectations, just not the unspoken ones. That's when I understood how much of my labor had been invisible, how much of the company's smoothness depended on things that were never acknowledged because they were never officially assigned. Silence, when chosen, has weight. It forces others to confront what they assumed would always be there. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was protecting my energy. But the effect was the same. My quiet created space, and in that space, truths began to surface. While they adjusted to my absence in small ways, I was paying attention to things they had never thought to hide. When you're seen as non-threatening, people speak freely around you. They forget you're listening. They assume you're aligned simply because you've always been accommodating. And that assumption creates carelessness. I noticed how often verbal commitments to clients contradicted written contracts, how certain promises were made casually, late at night, without documentation, how those promises were later softened, reframed, or denied, usually by the same people who had benefited from my presence when they were made. I noticed which emails were sent from personal devices, which instructions were given verbally instead of in meetings, which decisions were intentionally left ambiguous, so responsibility could be shifted later. None of this was illegal, that's important. It was simply sloppy, overconfident, built on the belief that everyone involved would continue to prioritize convenience over clarity. I began organizing information the way I always had, quietly, methodically, but now with intention, not to expose anyone, not to retaliate, just to understand the system I was operating inside. I mapped timelines, compared versions of the same story, noted how often my name appeared in follow-up emails as the person who would handle the aftermath of someone else's overreach. And I realized something else they hadn't noticed. I was the connective tissue, the one who translated between departments, between executives and clients, between intention and execution. Without me smoothing those transitions, gaps appeared, questions lingered. Accountability became uncomfortable. They didn't see it happening because it wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, structural, the kind of slow shift that doesn't register until it's too late to reverse. I also began to see how much leverage exists in understanding processes deeply. Not power over, but power within. The ability to choose when to speak and when not to. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I was gaining clarity. And clarity changes how you move. By the time they started to sense something was different, I had already repositioned myself. Quietly, legally, ethically. They never noticed the preparation because they didn't believe I needed it. The reveal didn't feel like a victory. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where everything clicked into place with cinematic clarity. It felt steady, almost calm. I was reviewing a client file late one afternoon, not because of an urgent request, but because I wanted to understand the full arc of the relationship. Years of correspondence, contract revisions, meeting notes, informal follow-ups that referenced conversations that had never been formally recorded. That's when I saw it clearly. So much of the company's risk management around this client rested on me. Not on policy, not on formal approvals, on my presence, my memory, my willingness to smooth things over when expectations drifted beyond what was written. There were assurances given after hours, over drinks, in text messages, in off-the-record conversations, that had never been escalated or documented. They weren't fraudulent. They were simply exposed, dependent on continued goodwill. And I was the bridge that made them safe. Without me translating, contextualizing, and softening, those assurances would stand alone, misaligned with contracts, vulnerable to scrutiny. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, not in shock, in understanding. This wasn't about catching anyone out. It was about recognizing that I had been carrying more than my share of risk without consent or acknowledgement, and that the expectation for me to continue doing so had been built quietly, without negotiation. For the first time, I understood my leverage, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. I didn't want to expose anyone. I didn't want to burn bridges. I wanted the system to correct itself. But systems don't correct themselves unless something forces them to. The reveal was private because it had to be. No one else needed to know yet. All I needed was clarity, and I had it. I knew what would happen if I withdrew fully. I knew which relationships would strain. I knew who would feel pressure first. And I knew that whatever came next, there was no going back to being the invisible buffer. That version of me no longer existed. Once you see leverage clearly, you don't rush to use it. That's the mistake people make when they think power is loud. I spent weeks sitting with the knowledge I had uncovered, letting it settle without trying to turn it into action. Every instinct I developed over the years told me to be careful, to stay reasonable, to fix things quietly so no one felt threatened. But another instinct, quieter, steadier, kept asking the same question. If nothing changes, what am I agreeing to become? That was the real decision point. Not whether to confront anyone, not whether to protect myself, but whether I was willing to keep living inside a role that required my silence to function. I listed my options the way I always did when work became complicated. I could speak up directly, request a meeting, explain how after-hours expectations had shifted beyond my role, and ask for clarity. That path looked clean on the surface, professional, rational. But I knew how that story ended. I'd be thanked for my honesty, assured my concerns were understood, promised that things would improve, and then, slowly, politely, nothing would change, because the system wasn't broken for the people who benefited from it. Another option was to quietly look for a new role elsewhere, leave without confrontation, preserve my reputation. Let the problem become someone else's responsibility. That option tempted me. It would have been easier, cleaner, no tension, no risk. But something about it felt like surrender. Leaving without naming what had happened would allow the pattern to continue unchanged. Someone else, another calm, capable woman, would step into the same invisible role, and I would carry the quiet knowledge that I'd escaped, but changed nothing. The third option was the one I kept circling back to, the one that made my chest tighten not with fear, but with gravity. I could stop cushioning the system. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just completely. I could align my work strictly with what was written, documented, and assigned. No informal translation, no after-hours smoothing, no unspoken coverage. I could allow gaps to surface naturally without filling them. This option was irreversible. Once you stop protecting people from the consequences of their assumptions, you can't pretend you didn't know better. I thought about the CEO, the way he spoke about culture, about trust, about loyalty. I thought about how easily those words had justified my availability, my presence, my compliance. And I realized something uncomfortable but clarifying. No one had ever asked me if I consented to carrying that weight. They had assumed, and assumptions don't deserve protection. The final confirmation came one evening when another message arrived, later than usual. It was almost 11. "Client's still out? Can you swing by for a bit?" I read it slowly, not with dread, with clarity. This wasn't an emergency, this wasn't a crisis. It was convenient. I imagined replying the way I always had. I imagined putting on a jacket, driving across the city, sitting at a table where my presence would make everything feel easier for everyone except me. And then I imagined not doing that. I imagined staying exactly where I was, letting the system operate without my quiet intervention. The difference between those two futures felt enormous. I didn't reply that night. The next morning, there was no follow-up, no apology, no explanation. Just the subtle sense that something had shifted, that an expectation had gone unmet. That was the moment the decision became real. I wasn't going to confront them emotionally. I wasn't going to demand recognition or fairness. I was going to stop participating in a structure that relied on my silence to function. Not because I was angry, because I was done being predecided. Once that choice was made, everything that followed was simply execution. And execution, unlike emotion, doesn't hesitate. What people misunderstand about moving in silence is that it isn't passive. It isn't avoidance, it's precision. Once I made the decision, I didn't change my tone, my demeanor, or my output. That was important. I stayed calm, consistent, predictable on the surface. I showed up to meetings on time. I met deadlines. I answered emails thoroughly. What changed was where my energy stopped flowing. I stopped translating vague instructions into workable plans. If something was unclear, I asked for clarification, in writing. If a request arrived after hours, I responded during business hours unless it was explicitly urgent. If a client's expectation wasn't documented, I didn't preemptively manage it. None of this violated policy. None of it could be criticized without someone having to admit what they'd been relying on before. I also began formalizing things I'd previously handled informally. Meeting summaries, decision recaps, follow-up emails that gently but unmistakably recorded who had said what and when. I framed everything as alignment, transparency, and best practice. And because I had always been seen as reasonable, no one questioned my motives. The CEO continued to operate the way he always had, making confident promises, leaning on relationships, trusting that things would work themselves out. My director continued to assume I'd smooth any friction that emerged. But friction did emerge. Clients asked questions that couldn't be answered easily. Internal teams flagged inconsistencies. Someone had to explain why a casual assurance didn't match a contract clause. Someone had to make decisions that had previously been softened or reinterpreted quietly. And that someone wasn't me anymore. I didn't point fingers. I didn't escalate unnecessarily. I simply stopped absorbing impact that wasn't mine to carry. There's a strange calm that comes with that kind of restraint. You stop reacting. You start observing. I watched how quickly responsibility became uncomfortable when it couldn't be delegated invisibly. I watched how often my name came up in conversations about things I was no longer managing. I watched the confusion, not panic yet, just confusion, spread slowly through spaces that had once felt effortlessly controlled. Still, no one confronted me, because from their perspective, I hadn't done anything. And that's the power of moving in silence. When you're no longer compensating for dysfunction, the dysfunction becomes visible on its own. Late-night requests tapered, not because boundaries were suddenly respected, but because they weren't being rewarded. My absence changed the cost-benefit calculation. What used to be easy now requires effort. I also took steps behind the scenes, quiet, responsible ones. I reviewed my job description. I aligned my workload explicitly with it. I ensured my performance metrics reflected documented responsibilities, not unspoken expectations. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to stand where I was without bending. By the time anyone realized something fundamental had shifted, the structure had already adjusted around my silence. Processes had slowed. Decisions required more scrutiny. Conversations became more careful. And the most important part? No one could accuse me of disloyalty. I hadn't withdrawn effort. I had withdrawn excess. And excess, once removed, reveals exactly who has been leaning on whom. The consequences didn't arrive in a single moment. They unfolded the way weather changes, slowly at first, then all at once. At first there was confusion. Meetings ran longer, simple decisions stalled. Emails multiplied where one conversation used to suffice. People started circling the same issues, asking the same questions in different ways, as if the answers were hiding somewhere they couldn't quite access anymore. I recognized that feeling. I'd been in the place they went without realizing it. Clients noticed before leadership did. They always do. A long-time account reached out asking for clarification on something they were sure had been agreed to. The wording was careful, but the implication was clear. Expectations had been set, and now they felt shaky. Normally, I would have handled that quietly, reframed it, smoothed it, explained context without assigning blame. This time, I forwarded the message to the appropriate chain, added neutral commentary, and waited. What followed was a series of internal meetings I wasn't invited to. That was new, not because I needed to be in them, but because for years I always had been. As a precaution, as support, as insurance. Now, I watched from the outside as leadership tried to reconstruct conversations that had never been properly recorded. I watched people search their memory for certainty that no longer felt solid. And still, no one accused me of withholding anything. Because I wasn't, I answered every direct question honestly. I shared documentation when asked. I clarified timelines when needed. But I no longer filled in the blanks proactively. That's when the tension began. Not outwardly, at least not yet, but in the small ways people behave when something they relied on stops working. Shorter patience, tighter smiles, a subtle edge in emails that used to be warm. My director asked me one afternoon if everything was okay. The question sounded casual, but it lingered. I said yes. I said I was focused. I said things felt aligned. All true. What I didn't say was that alignment felt different when it wasn't built on unspoken sacrifice. Soon after, the CEO started attending more follow-ups personally. He asked more detailed questions. He seemed unsettled, not angry, just less certain. I noticed how often my name came up in conversations that ended with, "Well, we'll have to figure that out." They were feeling the absence of something they'd never acknowledged as labor. And absence has a way of teaching lessons that presence never could. The late-night culture didn't disappear, but it lost its efficiency. Without me there to translate tone, to soften implications, to make things feel relational instead of transactional, those interactions became riskier, heavier. Clients pushed back more. Internal teams became cautious. The same behaviors that had once felt charismatic now required justification. That's when the quiet regret began, not spoken, not admitted, but visible. Not regret over how I'd been treated. Regret over how much had depended on me without anyone realizing it. And the most striking part? No one asked me to go back to how things were, because asking would require admitting that things had been wrong. So instead, they tried to adapt without me, and adaptation, when it's forced instead of chosen, is never graceful. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the problem was no longer technical. It was structural. And structure, once exposed, is difficult to disguise again. At first, leadership treated the situation the way they treated everything else, with process. More meetings appeared on calendars. More stakeholders were looped in. Follow-up documents grew longer, more detailed, more cautious. What used to be resolved with a single conversation now requires 3 approvals and a written summary. On paper, it looked like an improvement. In reality, it was compensation. They were trying to replace something that had never been formally acknowledged, the invisible labor that made their confidence safe, the quiet translation between what was promised and what was possible, the human buffer that allowed charisma to pass as a strategy. I could see the strain most clearly in moments that would have once been effortless. A client would reference a prior conversation, casually, without accusation, and suddenly the room would tighten. Eyes would shift. Someone would say, "Let me check on that," when weeks earlier the answer would have been immediate. Legal began appearing in places it hadn't before, not because there was wrongdoing, but because ambiguity had finally become visible. Without someone quietly contextualizing intent, words had to stand on their own. And words without cushioning are sharp. The CEO grew more present. He attended calls he used to skip. He asked for summaries that he used to trust others to handle. His confidence didn't disappear, but it hardened, became more careful, less fluid. What unsettled him wasn't failure, it was friction. The system still worked, but it no longer worked smoothly. And smoothness, I was realizing, had always been purchased with my availability. I was eventually invited into what was framed as a supportive conversation, a check-in. My director asked how I was feeling about the recent changes, whether the environment felt sustainable. The question hovered between concern and calculation. I answered calmly. I said I felt clear about my role, that my workload felt appropriate. I appreciated the renewed focus on documentation and alignment. Everything I said was true. What they wanted to ask, but didn't, was whether I could help them go back. Whether I could quietly step into the gaps again. Whether I could restore the ease they'd grown accustomed to without naming the cost. But by then, returning was impossible. Because once you recognize that your discomfort has been normalized for someone else's convenience, you can't unknow it. You can't volunteer yourself back into a role that requires your boundaries to remain undefined. The panic never erupted. It spread instead, slowly, professionally, through leadership as a realization that something essential had shifted without their permission. They searched for fixes that didn't require self-reflection, new tools, new protocols, new language. What they never searched for was accountability. And without that, every attempt to fix the situation felt like rearranging furniture in a room with a cracked foundation. It wasn't that the damage was irreparable. It was that repairing it would require admitting that the damage had been done deliberately, through habit, assumption, and silence. By the time they understood that, it was already too late. The confrontation didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with scheduling. A calendar invite appeared one morning, short, neutral, almost polite. No agenda beyond a single line. Alignment discussion. Attendees, the CEO, my director, and I. I accepted without hesitation. By then, I wasn't anxious. Anxiety comes from uncertainty, and I had none left. I knew exactly what this meeting was about, even if they hadn't found the language for it yet. The room was quiet when I arrived. Glass walls, afternoon light, coffee untouched. The CEO spoke first. His tone was measured, careful in the way people become when they sense they've lost control of a familiar dynamic. He said they'd noticed changes. Those things felt different, slower, more complex. He said they wanted to make sure everyone felt supported. It was an opening, carefully constructed, an invitation for me to explain myself, to reassure them that nothing fundamental had changed. I didn't take it. I thanked them for the conversation. I said I agreed that things felt different. And then I said something that landed heavier than anything emotional could have. I've aligned my work more closely with my defined role. Silence followed, not hostile, processing. My director nodded slightly, as if that made sense. The CEO leaned back, listening. He asked if I felt there had been confusion about expectations. Yes, I said, for a while. Still calm, still neutral. I explained briefly, factually, how after-hours requests had increased over time, how certain responsibilities had become assumed rather than discussed. I had found myself managing risk informally, without clarity or consent. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't reference emotion unless asked. I spoke the way I always had, precisely. The CEO responded with surprise that felt genuine. He said he hadn't realized I felt that way, that everything had been intended as trust, not pressure. I believed him. That was the strange part. Intent and impact had simply never been required to meet. I acknowledged that. I said I understood how the situation had evolved, that no one had set out to cross lines deliberately. And then I said the sentence that changed the room. Even so, I'm no longer comfortable operating in unspoken roles. Not angry, not hurt, just finished. The CEO asked what I wanted going forward. The question was careful, negotiable. I told him I wanted clarity, boundaries that were defined, not implied. After-hours engagement was optional and compensated appropriately, not culturally expected. Professional contribution that didn't rely on personal availability. There was no pushback, no argument, because by then, the cost of pretending this was a misunderstanding had become too high. The meeting ended politely, cordially, almost warmly. No one apologized directly. No one needed to. What mattered was that the dynamic had been named, without heat, without drama, without spectacle. I walked out of that room lighter than I'd felt in years, not because I'd won, but because I had finally spoken from a place where silence was no longer required for me to belong. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No announcements were made. No policies were suddenly rewritten with my name between the lines. The office didn't buzz with gossip. Life simply continued, but it continued differently. The most noticeable change was internal. The constant low-grade tension I had carried for so long, something I hadn't even recognized as tension until it was gone, began to fade. My evenings belonged to me again, not because I had demanded them, but because I had stopped surrendering them preemptively. At work, my role became clearer, sharper, less porous. Requests came with context now, with timelines, with acknowledgement. After-hours messages still happened occasionally, but they arrived differently, clearly framed as optional, often accompanied by an understanding that no was a complete sentence. What surprised me most was that my professional credibility didn't diminish. If anything, it strengthened. When I spoke in meetings, people listened more carefully. When I raised concerns, they were treated as signals rather than inconveniences. I was no longer the person who absorbed uncertainty quietly. I was the person whose clarity prevented it. The CEO adjusted too, though subtly. He became more deliberate in what he promised, more careful about what he assumed others would handle. He didn't stop being confident, but his confidence gained edges, boundaries of its own. I watched this without satisfaction or resentment, just awareness. The system hadn't collapsed. It had matured, and I had changed within it. I was no longer trying to be indispensable. That urge had disappeared entirely. In its place was something steadier, self-respect. I stopped measuring my value by how much discomfort I could absorb. I stopped equating professionalism with silence. I stopped believing that being liked was a prerequisite for being treated fairly. That doesn't mean I became hard. If anything, I became more generous, because generosity that isn't coerced feels different. It has choice in it. It has boundaries that make it sustainable. I still help, I still support, I still care, but I don't disappear to do it. Outside of work, the shift echoed in unexpected ways. I noticed how often I used to soften my opinions, minimize my needs, and preemptively accommodate. Those habits didn't vanish overnight, but they lost their grip. I started pausing before agreeing, asking myself whether I actually wanted to say yes, or whether I was just avoiding friction. That pause became a practice, and that practice became an identity, People often imagine that standing up for yourself requires confrontation. That's loud. That it's risky. That turns you into someone harsher than you want to be. My experience was the opposite. The moment I stopped performing the version of myself that made others comfortable at my expense, I became calmer, clearer, more at ease in my own presence. I didn't lose relationships, I lost assumptions. And there's a difference. Some people adjusted easily, others drifted slightly. Those whose connection to me had been built on access rather than respect. I let that happen without grief. Not every distance is a loss. What remained were relationships that felt mutual, conversations that didn't rely on me managing the emotional temperature of the room, work that asked for my expertise, not my endurance. Who I am now isn't defined by that conflict, but it was shaped by it. I'm still quiet, still observant, still calm, but my quiet now has weight. My calm has boundaries, and my presence is a choice, not a convenience. I don't need to be the person everyone relies on. I need to be the person I don't abandon. And that, I've learned, is the most durable form of dominance there is. I used to think that stories like this needed villains, a single person to point to, a moment of undeniable wrongdoing, something clean and obvious that made choosing sides easy. But that's not how most boundary violations happen. They happen quietly, politely, wrapped in praise and trust and opportunity. They happen in systems that reward availability more than integrity, and in cultures that confuse flexibility with obligation. They happen when people like me, capable, calm, eager to be helpful, learn that saying yes keeps the room comfortable, even if it makes us smaller. The hardest lesson for me wasn't learning how to say no. It was learning that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for protecting my dignity. For a long time, I believed that if I was reasonable enough, patient enough, accommodating enough, the system would eventually reciprocate. That fairness would emerge naturally if I just kept showing up with good intentions. It didn't. What changed things wasn't anger or confrontation. It was a withdrawal, not of effort, but of excess, of unpaid labor, of emotional smoothing, of after-hours compliance framed as loyalty. The moment I stopped making it easy for others to overstep, the truth of the situation surfaced on its own. And that's the part people don't talk about enough. You don't have to explode to be heard. You don't have to shame anyone to reclaim yourself. You don't have to win loudly for your boundaries to matter. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating for what was never yours to carry. This story isn't meant to instruct you to burn bridges or punish anyone. It's not about forcing respect through fear. It's about recognizing when your silence has become a resource others are extracting without your consent, and deciding calmly to take it back. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about self-possession. It's about choosing clarity over comfort, integrity over approval, long-term alignment over short-term peace. It's about understanding that professionalism does not require self-erasure, and that being kind does not mean being endlessly available. If there's one thing I hope stays with you, it's this. When you stop abandoning yourself, you don't become harder, you become truer. And truth has a way of reshaping rooms without raising its voice. The world doesn't always reward that immediately, but it does respond to it eventually. And when it does, you'll realize you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong system to value something it had been taking for free. Before we end, I want to open the conversation to you, because stories like this rarely belong to just one person. Have you ever reached a moment where you realized that staying quiet was costing you more than speaking up? And what changed when you finally chose yourself?